Well, I made a very bold comment about Catherine's leadership in the field of theology, and I'm going to make a similar bold comment about Gary Dorrien's leadership in the field of Christian ethics. I can do this not just in terms of my own perception, but my very good friend and colleague, Joe Huff, was for some years president of Union Theological Seminary, and he had a chair which was called the Reinhold Niebuhr Chair. And in a previous generation, the one that I grew up in, Reinhold Niebuhr was the premier social ethicist. And of course, you can't be a very good social ethicist unless you also are a good theologian. But we won't go into the complications that would introduce. But he looked around the country and he decided that Gary Dorrien was the leading social ethicist. And so he persuaded him to come to Union Theological Seminary to occupy the chair of Reinhold Niebuhr. So I should mention that Gary, as a social ethicist, not only studies what has happened in the past in Christian thought and what is happening publicly, but also tackles the question of what's going on in the world right now. And he wrote a book about the neoconservatives that I think probably the best analysis that was available, and he has very recently published a book about President Obama that is probably the most reliable way of understanding what is going on at the present time. So this is not simply formal ethics, this is also the actual ethics dealing with the real world in which we live. And we are very grateful that in the process of his research, he has come to take the wide process tradition very seriously. The wide process tradition includes many others besides the particular form of process thought that we emphasize here in Claremont, but it certainly includes that. And Gary understands us perhaps better than we understand ourselves. So please, Gary, let's see you this side.
Thank you, John. Well, good evening, friends. We've already had one just sublime talk tonight. It's daunting to follow that one, and it's daunting to be standing up here with David Griffin and John Cobb. And it's always a delight for me just to come back to Claremont to give one of these talks. I'm starting to feel like it's my home to be here. The history of my assignment for tonight was apparently more complicated than it was for some of the other speakers. I got 4 different messages about what I was supposed to do here. It was clear in each case that I'm supposed to be something of a table setter for all that's to follow for the next couple days, so I was good for that. There was some suggestion about, well, something about just David's contribution to process thought fairly generally. Yeah, I was good for that. Process theology, sure, we'll do process theology. But then there was a strong suggestion in one, and then in one of these assignments, it was simply, no, we just want you to talk about David's rendering of the similarities and differences between Hartshorn and Whitehead. Well, that one seemed less interesting to me, actually, than the first two, but I'm actually going to take a shot at all of these subjects tonight, and in doing so, I'm going to emphasize David's pan-experientialism, his rationalism, and his panentheism. I'm going to begin by saying a word about Whiteheadian process theology that's somewhat in the mode of what John was just saying here, before getting to David in particular. There are many things, as many of you know, there are many things that I admire about Whiteheadian thought. It has a genius philosophical founder in Alfred North Whitehead. It offers a picture of a divinely influenced universe oriented toward beauty and the intensification of experience. It is consistent with the modern understanding of evolution as a long, slow, gradual process of layered stages in which complex forms of life build upon simple ones. It's consistent, for the most part at least, with relativity theory, in which the universe is dynamic and interconnected, Space and time are inseparable, and gravity and acceleration are indistinguishable, and all of that makes this metaphysical worldview the greatest of the 20th century, ready-made for a theology in which God is constantly absorbing the passing world and retaining its variety in the immediacy and final unity of God's everlasting present. God is always in process, with creation as the lure for feeling and creative transformation, the eternal urge of desire, as Whitehead put it, that lures us to make creative, life-enhancing choices. But John Cobb and David Griffin and other process theologians didn't just rest with that pretty picture. And so many of us here cut our teeth theologically on the early engagements of process theology with environmentalism, feminism, and liberation theology. From the beginnings in the 1970s, the process school has originated or produced a plethora of feminist and womanist theologies, new forms of environmental theology, Christian-Buddhist dialogue, various engagements with postmodern and post-structuralist criticism, an academic industry known as the religion science dialogue, and significant inroads into China and South Korea. This school of theology, despite its abortive beginning, its notoriously unintelligible jargon, and its rather belated rebirth in the 1940s, has become the one indispensable school of thought for progressive theology as a whole. Some Whiteheadians worry a great deal about the scientific standing of process thought and the referentiality of its claims. We've got the major one up here tonight. And some urge that Whitehead's concepts really matter mostly if they work as generating illuminative metaphors. But in both cases, the Whiteheadian language of flux, order, and process is suited, perfectly suited, for interdisciplinary dialogue. Today at progressive U.S. American seminaries and divinity schools, we say that we need to uphold the best of our traditions of social Christianity, ecumenism, feminism, and the many kinds of liberation theology, and we need to do it in a way that is global, connected to world cultures, committed to the liberating perspectives of LGBTQ theory and criticism, and engaged in interreligious dialogue and theologies of world religions. Describing that ideal is not so difficult. You can do it in a sentence. But working out a viable model for it is very difficult. The best one that we have is the Whiteheadian model. The process school has distinguished itself by taking the risks that go with having very large intellectual ambitions and grappling creatively with the hardest intellectual problems and thinking on a global and cosmic scale and showing concern for the common good in the natural world. No one better represents the intellectual ambition of process theology than David Griffin. He has surpassed everyone in challenging the materialistic, atheistic modernism of the academy, and his work is prolific and wide-ranging to the point of being impossible to summarize. As we have just heard in a luminous paper from Catherine, the major work of David's early career was his important work on theodicy, God, power, and evil, and since it goes with two parts of my assignment, I'm going to do a little bit of a reprise of it here. It is strange that no process thinker had systematically taken up this subject. Not Hartshorne, Bernie Loomer, Bernard Maitland, Daniel Day Williams, Norman Pittenger, nobody of that generation. It's strange because process theology offers a distinct answer to the theodicy issue, and there is no issue that has drawn so many people to the process perspective, no other issue more than this one. Yet there was no process theodicy until 1976. Most of the time, authors hate it when you tell them that one of their early books was the most important or influential one that they wrote. When you're fresh out of graduate school, you only know this much. You try to get as much as you can out of that little bit that you know, and it's galling to be told, decades later, that you made your biggest splash when you were just a half-informed youth. So, I stress that God, Power, and Evil is not the best book that David ever wrote. But it is the book that launched a whole genre of process theology. It evoked strong responses for a decade. It established the keynotes of David's process theology. And it set off so much discussion that he had to write a sequel in 1991. Catherine referred to it after trying to withdraw from the back and forth discussion. Griffin argued that Whiteheadian theism solves the perennial problems of theodicy because it distinctively holds together the reality of true creaturely freedom, God's moral goodness, and genuine evil. God doesn't control creatures because God cannot control creatures. Creativity is a universal feature of actuality and is inherent in it. To be creative is to possess real powers of self-creation and other creation. Therefore, it's metaphysically impossible for God to possess a monopoly of power, for God needs an actual world, and all actualities contain powers of self-determination. Embracing Whitehead's Platonist idea that God's agency is persuasive, not coercive, Griffin grounded his rejection of divine omnipotence on the metaphysical principle that the entire realm of actuality contains inherent powers of creativity. Then he took a Hartsonian step beyond Whitehead. This is my first point on this part of my assignment. Whitehead suggested that the metaphysical principles of reality are determined by God's primordial decision. But following Hartshorne, Griffin argued that the metaphysical categories are beyond all decision, even God's. Whiteheadian theism is most coherent as a theory about the way things are necessarily. It's about the necessary metaphysical basis of the world, this world, and all others. Absolute coercion requires embodiment, but God has no hands with which to make things happen. God has a body only in the sense that the world is God's body. God is the soul of the world, whose causal relations are always directly individual to individual. There are plenty of process theologians who believe that pan-experientialism is the weakest and most dispensable part of Whitehead's system. But I believe that Griffin's stout defense of pan-experientialism is one of the great strengths of his work. Dualists fail to explain how such radically different things as mind and matter can causally influence each other. They violate the principle of continuity, and they violate the principle of the conservation of energy, that the energy of the universe has remained constant since the Big Bang. Materialist theories fail to account for the unity of experience, the unity of bodily behavior, and the reality of freedom. If there's no mind, how do we possess a unified conscious experience? How can I orchestrate different physical actions at the same time? How can a personal center of consciousness be a wholly material being? Griffin counters that minds are real, but thoroughly natural. The unsolved dilemmas of the dualistic, dogmatic, materialist, and emergent materialist theories indicate that something is wrong with the reigning assumptions in this field. In David's rendering, the debate between dualists and materialists is a family quarrel between theorists who have taken for granted the early Enlightenment view that the basic units of nature have no experiential features. The Whiteheadian alternative naturalizes a really existing mind. If experiences are actual things and all actualities have experience, the aspect of the world that we know most directly, which is our own conscious experience, is not a supernatural or an anomalous phenomenon. Mind and matter go all the way down. The regnant theories commit Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, failing to recognize that their basic notions are abstractions. Pan-experientialism replaces the substantialist premises of dualism and materialism with Whiteheadian process, showing that experiences have spatial extension and that bodies endure through time. It avoids the dualistic problems of discontinuity and interaction between ontologically dissimilar entities. It affirms and accounts for the reality of experience, freedom, and the unity of experience and behavior. The Whiteheadian approach doesn't have to solve the impossible problem of drawing a line between experiencing and non-experiencing individuals. And it doesn't have to explain how experience can be generated by non-experiencing entities or processes. I do think that rhetorically, and in living out your intellectual lineage, those of you who are Whiteheadians do have a tendency to play down the idealistic element of your position. You are so determined to claim the mantle of realism and to cut loose from Cartesian anxiety and Kantian subjectivity that I think you misrepresent your relationship to German idealism. A few of you here knew this was coming, but what can I say? It's a personal hobby horse. Most of you, including David Griffin, have the trademark idealistic fixation with the importance of consciousness and freedom. To say, as you do, that nature is like human subjects, or that to be a person is to experience and to be experienced, is to line up with Schelling and Hegel in conceiving reality as nothing less than the self-thinking of spirit. Spirit empties itself into the real world of sensuous particularity in its creation of the world as an experience of itself, as Hegel put it, or as the lure for creative transformation, as in Whitehead. Anyone who knows post-Kantian idealism and is not a Whiteheadian can see and feel the German idealism in Whiteheadian thought. But I digress. Griffin makes the strongest case that I know for the view that it makes more sense to say that all actualities have experience than to claim that experiences are not actual things. In his rendering, pan-experientialism is not a form of vitalism. It does not claim that a new causal force emerged when life broke into mechanistic nature, and it's not as implausible as dualism or materialism. He emphasizes that the pan-experientialist Hall of Fame includes people like, Leibniz, Spinoza, Lurza, James, Bergson, Peirce, Whitehead, F.C.S. Schiller, C.H. Waddington, David Bohm. It is unfortunate that some of these intellectual heroes taught that all things have feelings. This idea that rocks and minerals have feelings is the bane of good pan-experientialism. Griffin follows Leibniz, Whitehead, and Hartshorne in distinguishing between individuals that respond to their environment and mere aggregational entities that do not bear psychic life. A rock cannot experience because it lacks the coordinating and unifying occasion that would enable it to respond to its environment as a unity with any degree of freedom. David's chief work on this subject is titled Unsnarling the World Not. He argues vigorously in it that only the pan-experiential option integrates scientific knowledge with the core beliefs that are necessary to rational thought, because only it reconciles the element of truth in dualist theory, that mind and brain are distinct and interact, with the element of truth in materialist theory, that all actual things are physical. Since the prevailing scientific picture of reality finds no place for consciousness or freedom, something has to be wrong with it. The key to making science more true and real is to make experience a fundamental category. There is a connection between David's emphasis on the unreality of materialism and the increasing emphasis in his later works on the existence of what he calls hardcore common sense truths. His concept of what he calls constructive postmodernism has always included a belief in hardcore common sense, but by the end of the 1990s, it was the centerpiece of his argument. Philosophically, this position is rooted in Scottish common sense realism, and David stresses that Whitehead also believed in universal truths of experience. In Process and Reality, Whitehead declared that all thinking must bow to the presuppositions that are necessary for the regulation of our lives, and that all such presumptions are imperative in experience. Like Thomas Reid and the Scottish moralists, Griffin contends that certain common presumptions are universally presupposed in practice, even when they're denied in theory. Most common sense ideas are culturally conditioned, but some are universal facts of experience. In his early version of this argument, he described causality, freedom, genuine evil, and the existence of an actual world as common sense universals. All rational people practice the conviction that every event is influenced by other events. Our behavior is at least partly self-determining. Some things happen that should not have happened, and real things exist external to one's consciousness. Griffin contends, very much like Reed, that these ideas are common to all human beings at the presuppositional level and are inevitably presupposed in practice. Moreover, they can't be denied verbally without self-contradiction. One assumes causality in the act of causing oneself or others to doubt causality. One uses one's freedom in the act of renouncing the idea of freedom. Even professed solipsists assume an actual world when they drive a car or question the existence of others. Expanding on this theme, he added that time, axiological realism, the correspondence of interpretive ideas to the real world as the measure of truth, and the ultimate meaningfulness of life are also universal truths. Everybody distinguishes among the past, present, and future, and recognizes that some things are better than others. The ultimate test of any philosophical position, David argues, is whether or not it does justice to the hardcore ideas that are inevitably presupposed in practice by all human beings. Well, that is a thoroughly rationalist claim, that thinking must attempt to integrate the universal facts of experience. By that definition, Whitehead and Hartshorne were unyielding rationalists, although both of them did have room for Peirce's fallibilist principle that all notions must be subject to doubt. To Griffin, that means that precise formulations of hardcore truths are, of course, always fallible. Moreover, Peirce affirmed the existence of universal facts of experience. Common sense was one of his central doctrines. Whitehead, by making the inevitable presuppositions of practice crucial to his system, adopted a defining feature of Peirce's and James's pragmatism. To Griffin, this combination of metaphysical and practical reason is what is needed to ward off the skepticism and nihilism of radical postmodern theory. Constructive postmodernism refuses the fashionable indulgence of doubting things that must be presupposed to be true in the very act of thinking. Theology cannot go down the road of radical postmodernism without playing into the hands of sophisticated fundamentalists and nihilistic relativists. If religion is not an important mode of knowledge, it deserves to be marginalized as it has been under modernity. Knowledge consists of beliefs that are true and well-founded, and religion cannot get along without justified beliefs. David therefore rejects the postmodern claim that all facts are theory-laden products of prior conceptual and cultural systems. If each worldview simply creates its own facts and we never experience any data directly, we have no reason to reject theologies assuming a geocentric universe or biblical inerrancy. To him, the crucial theological task is to rehabilitate theism while adhering to the formal standards of modern science and philosophy. Process thought holds in view the same naturalistic world described by modern science and philosophy, but it teaches that human beings directly intuit divine reality at all times. God is the really existing soul of the world that acts through the entire evolutionary process and directly influences higher-level actualities. Put differently, God is the supreme holy reality that is directly and constantly prehended by human beings. Well, that comes pretty close to what Alvin Plantinga calls a properly basic claim, that belief in God is properly held without appealing to inferential evidence. Plantinga says that believing in God is on the same level epistemologically as believing in the existence of other minds, the past, or an external world. And David Griffin says that Plantinga goes overboard in two respects. One, his God is too traditionally Christian to be properly basic. And two, the existence of an external world is knowable through perception, and thus it's a fact of experience. But David Griffin does espouse an ostensibly generic version of Plantinga's argument that belief in God is constitutive in the foundations of knowledge. The sense of a holy reality is properly basic to human experience. Thus, a generic form of the holy reality experienced by people from various traditions would be, and is, universal. Griffin's early version of this claim described God as the supreme, non-derivative, holy power that is alone worthy of worship and ultimate concern. The purpose of creator of the world, perfectly good, and source of moral norms, and the ultimate guarantee of life's meaning and hope of ultimate victory of good over evil. That ruled out the idea of God as a cluster of ideals, which they liked back in the first generation of the Chicago School, or the identification of God with anything that's imperfect, or definitions devoid of aim, such as being itself, or any identification of God with evil impulses, and all forms of might makes right theodicy. In his later versions, Griffin adds that God is a personal being, perfect in love, goodness, and beauty, supreme, perhaps even perfect in power, omnipresent, and necessarily and everlastingly existent. I fail to see how this is not a quite specific God. Even if one grants Griffin's claim that it is too generic to be a doctrine of God, which is a specific version of belief in a holy reality. I'm going to circle back to this point in a moment, but I'm at this point overdue to complete my assignment about Whitehead vis-a-vis Hartshorne, on which Griffin usually sides with Hartshorne when there is a difference. No one has contributed more than David Griffin to our understanding of the differences and similarities between Whitehead and Hartshorne. In his definitive account, Hartshorne and Whitehead held different views of divine dipolarity, eternal possibilities, secondary qualities, metaphysical principles, philosophical method, the perishing of actual occasions, and objective immortality. Most importantly, they differed about the nature of divine reality, though not in a way that process theologians favoring Hartshorne often say. Griffin shows that so-called dipolar theism is actually doubly dipolar, and Whitehead and Hartshorne both had versions of both kinds. Whitehead famously distinguished between God's primordial and consequent natures, conceiving God as influencing the world, primordial, and as being influenced by the world, consequent. Hartshorne distinguished between God's abstract essence and concrete states, conceiving God as unchanging, abstract essence, and as changing as part of the temporal process, concrete states. Against the tendency of many process thinkers, Griffin plays up the differences between these models, where there are two kinds of dipolarity at issue. One is about God influencing and being influenced. The other is about God not changing and changing. With differences in emphasis, Whitehead and Hartshorne both affirm both kinds of dipolarity, but Whitehead's version was flawed because he tried to account for both dipolarities under the primordial consequent distinction. Under the primordial category, Whitehead described God as unchanging and as influencing the world. Under the consequent category, he described God as changing and as influenced by the world. To Griffin, that overtaxes the primordial consequent distinction. According to Whitehead, the initial aims through which God influences the world from God's primordial nature alone, but Whitehead also described God's primordial nature as an abstraction, a mere factor in God, deficient in actuality. If the primordial nature is an abstraction, this is Griffin reasoning now, if the primordial nature is an abstraction, it cannot be the source of initial aims. For Whitehead taught, as a metaphysical principle, that only actualities can provide explanatory reasons. In this way, Whitehead's account of the primordial nature contradicted his maxim that God must not be treated as an exception to metaphysical principles. A.H. Johnson once pressed Whitehead on that very point. Whitehead replied that it was a great carelessness on his part to treat a mere abstraction in God as an actuality. Following Hartshorne and the early John Cobb, Griffin argues that if the initial aims come from God's unchanging primordial nature, they cannot be relevant to changing specific situations in the world. Whitehead's account of the initial aims was contradictory. Thus, his concept of God had to be reconceptualized. Griffin embraces the Hartshornian view of God as an ordered society of occasions of experience. If God is a society of events analogous to a human soul, the initial aims can be viewed as an act of God's entire being in the moment. Whitehead taught that the real enduring things in life are societies, and his ontology was based on the idea that enduring individuals are fundamentally relational, not single actual entities. Yet he described God as a single actual entity that is everlastingly growing together. Griffin counters that if God is everlastingly in concrescence, God must receive efficient causation and final causation simultaneously, and that would make it unlike any other finite occasion. Thus, Whitehead made another metaphysical exception for God. Griffin accepts Hartshorne's proposal that God is a personal society of occasions of experience, a living person. But Hartshorne dropped most of Whitehead's doctrine of eternal objects, and thus he failed to develop a fully dipolar concept of God. Whitehead conceived the eternal objects objectively as mathematical, Platonic forms, and subjectively as primordially envisaged means by which God lures the world to actualize values. Hartshorne accepted eternal objects only in the objective sense. Griffin, I think, very compellingly combines both kinds of divine dipolarity. Quote, "We must think of God as both necessary and contingent, both absolute and relative, both changing and unchanging, both independent and dependent, both non-temporal and temporal," unquote. God's diverse aspects are God's abstract essence and concrete states. By the former, God is necessary and absolute. By the latter, God is contingent and relative. God is unchanging with respect to character, but changing in relation to the world process. God is a causal agent that infuses the world with ideals and a person who is affected by the world process. For Griffin, the reality of freedom, causality, the external world, the past, moral values, ultimate meaning, and the sense of a holy reality are all certain, while his doctrines of God and immortality, being doctrines, are less certain. He claims overwhelming probability for naturalistic theism and strong probability for some form of continued consciousness beyond bodily death. We have one session on that one tomorrow. For pan-experientialism, he claims the status of best theory, though he notes that Hartshorne claimed that it was a certainty. Always, he says, liberal theology has to begin with the hardcore facts of human experience, then choose the best theories at hand, then refine and solidify probable convictions. The liberal principle of upholding the authority of reason and experience is indispensable. On the other hand, the liberal tradition wrongly capitulated to a sensationalist dogma limiting perception to physical sense and a mechanistic dogma rendering fundamental nature devoid of experience, spontaneity, and self-determination. Constructive postmodern liberal theology, in Griffin's telling, is a means of deliverance from that sorry and unreal world. It rests on the 3 P's of Whiteheadian theism: prehension, the idea of intuitive apprehension; panentheism, the idea that God and the world are internal to each other; and panexperientialism, the idea that all aggregate transcending entities possess some measure of experience. Griffin plays up Whitehead's rationalism about common sense universalism. Facts of experience, he says, provide a criterion for judging worldviews that's universal, not relativistic, and not culturally conditioned. Any philosophy that does not rest upon hardcore common sense cannot be a guide to practice. Certain truths of experience are transcultural and universal, standing in judgment over worldviews. Any perspective that purports to say something worthwhile must assume and employ them. I fail to see how that is not a type of foundationalism, even if it's not the type that builds a house based on some distinct first principles. Certainly, there is a meaningful difference between saying, as Thomas Reid did, that every house needs a foundation, and saying, as David Griffin does, that thinking must begin wherever we happen to be. But to say that common sense universalism is the only worthwhile way to do philosophy is to make an aggressively foundationalist claim. When he started on this path, David made the criterion of self-contradiction central to its definition. Interpretation is variable and fallible, he always allowed, but causality, freedom, an external world, and genuine evil are universal facts of experience that cannot be rejected verbally without contradiction. Later, he added truth as correspondence to the actual world. But universality is a powerful idea, and Griffin's list kept getting longer. Eventually, it included the ultimate meaning of life itself and a sense of a supreme holy reality. With each addition, his appeal to performative self-contradiction got weaker. Well, just to begin with, Immanuel Kant was notoriously perplexed about causality, freedom, time, and radical evil. And of course, more recently, the correspondence theory of truth has come into a fair amount of dispute. Much more importantly than any of that, many people hold with ample consistency that life has no ultimate meaning and there is no holy reality to experience. Whatever one makes of causality, freedom, time, and radical evil, Griffin's strongest argument for common sense universals does not prove his ultimacy arguments. Ultimately, nothing may be important. All that Griffin can argue here is that his ultimacy arguments do not lack some power of necessity. For if nothing is ultimately important, life itself is ultimately meaningless. Now that is a Kantian argument. But Griffin avoids post-Kantian idealism like the plague. Never mind that what's ultimately at stake here for him and for Whiteheadian theism is the same thing that German idealists fixated upon, the spiritual importance of freedom, feeling, consciousness, and moral value. Kantian idealism was the wellspring of modern theology. The key to Kant's system, terrible ironies and white supremacism notwithstanding, was the emancipating and unifying reality of freedom, even as Kant admitted that he did not understand it. Kant's transcendental idealism laid the groundwork for all post-Kantian theologies by theorizing about the creative powers of mind and the categories of understanding as universal conditions of experience. That led to Schelling and Hegel privileging becoming over being, which yielded Hegel's concept of God as spiraling relationality embracing all otherness and difference. God's infinite subjectivity in Hegel's concept was an infinite intersubjectivity of holding differences together in a play of creative relationships, not dissolving into sameness. German idealism put panentheism into play in modern theology by conceiving it as irreducibly dynamic and relational, the very things that supposedly distinguish the Whiteheadian school. God is the intersubjective whole of wholes, not the wholly other. It was Hegel's fluid, spiraling, relational panentheism that changed the debate in theology about how God might relate to the world, offering an alternative to pantheism and the static being God later rejected by Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Levinas. There are Whiteheadians who draw upon the idealist wellsprings of liberal theology in their work, especially Phil Clayton. But Griffin absorbed the aversion of his school to German idealism, even as he and his school refashion its consuming preoccupations. One of the things I most appreciate about Griffin's work is his strong defense of theology as an academic field and his resistance to an exclusively religious studies approach to religion. Religious thinkers should be able to discuss and defend religious ideas in the same way that philosophers and physicists pursue ideas in their fields. What would philosophy be if you couldn't make arguments about first-order truth claims? Physicists go on about electrons, quarks, black holes, gravitons. Nobody tells them they should stick to meta descriptions. The study of religion cannot be a serious academic discipline if it's not permitted to pursue truth questions in the open, critical, position-taking manner of all the other disciplines. Moreover, theology cannot meaningfully address the modern crisis of belief if it shies away from making truth claims. Like Hartshorne, Cobb, Bernard Maitland, Griffin believes that naturalistic process theism is the answer to the crisis of belief. Like Maitland, he looks for a way to warm the spiritual coldness of Chicago empiricism. Unlike Maitland, he puts no stock in the resacralizing power of mythical symbolism. To him, remythologization mostly obscures the real problems of intelligibility and credible belief. If process thought is true, it's true fundamentally as a metaphysical description. Metaphysical principles trump any Maitland-like claims that might be made about the evocative appeal of process metaphors. When I wrote about Griffin in Volume 3 of my trilogy on liberal theology, I was expecting to press very hard on Griffin versus Maitland and Marjorie Suhaki on that subject. But then I talked to him about it, and he said, you know, I've never said there's anything wrong with appropriating Whitehead in the way that Maitland or Suhaki or Catherine Keller do. He reasoned that his rationalistic Whiteheadianism complemented the more aesthetic, pragmatic, and feminist forms of process theology. In fact, this is a direct quote. Quote, "The kinds of things I do seem to meet the needs of quite a number of people. And Catherine's and Marjorie's writings appeal to many people that mine don't. This is just a Jamesian Whiteheadian point about different temperaments." Suhaki put it more sharply to me when I asked her about it, describing David as, quote, "the last important defender of the rationalist approach to process theology." Quote, "The old preoccupation with finding the true metaphysical system is fading away." So I went back to David. He was lecturing in Michigan at the time. "What does it mean even to claim that you espouse the true metaphysical system?" I asked him. He waved it off. He said, "All right, when I get to heaven, I don't expect to find that I had the true metaphysical system. But I do believe that Whitehead developed the best one, and I'm not going to sell it short." Certainly no one could ever say, with any degree of justified true belief, that David Griffin sold short Whiteheadian theism or liberal theology. Thank you, friends.
Wow. That's my first comment. My second comment is, how can a social ethicist be better at philosophical theology than most of us theologians? Thirdly, I was very encouraged by the notion that Gary feels at home at Claremont. I think we need to do something about that. Also, I particularly like the fact that you stress the pan-experientialism, because that is not a notion, as you rightly say, that's emphasized a lot. Now, to get on the other side. Foundationalist, yes, in one sense, no, in another sense. We would have to talk about. But I was saying in the precise meaning that foundationalism is usually used, and that's used as a criticism to say that foundationalism is bad because of A, B, C. I say that what I'm doing is not that. We'd have to talk about that. Now, more serious point, the expansion of the notion of hardcore common sense. I think you're right that the ones I talked about in the earlier days were more self-evident. That is, it's more self-evident that to contradict one of these things necessarily involves one in contradiction. Self-contradiction. But what about these other things? The holy reality, the meaninglessness of life, and correspondence theory of truth. I think you're right. I mean, obviously you are right. They're not as obvious. But the more I thought about them, I do think that they are common sense at the level of presuppositions. That is what people do presuppose. I think that's most clear about correspondence theory of truth. How can you have anybody giving an argument against correspondence without presupposing the idea that ideas somehow correspond to the things they're talking about? The meaning of life, it's certainly the case that many people become nihilistic or they commit suicide because they've decided that life has no meaning for them. But does that necessarily mean they're saying that life as such has no meaning, that the universe has no meaning? Schubert Ogden, as you know, was one who made that, and Schubert is not normally one that I appeal to, but I thought he was right in making that argument. And then finally, that in some sense of a holy reality, you're certainly right that the way I laid out, the way you summarized there, my understanding of God is certainly, yes, very particular. Is a Whiteheadian, Hartshornian view of God. But I think I distinguish between that and the more general sense of a holy reality, and that we can, even though it's not as easy a case to make, that one can make a case that in that very vague sense, a holy reality is presupposed.